By the mid-18th century, the Enlightenment's quest for certain knowledge had reached an impasse. The Scottish philosopher David Hume had introduced a skeptical challenge that questioned the very possibility of proving scientific laws. This crisis grew out of the core empiricist assumption that the mind begins as a blank slate. In this view, every piece of knowledge we possess is acquired through sensory experience, which the mind receives passively. Hume identified a logical failure in this passive model. Observing a sequence of events does not prove a necessary law. If we only watch one event follow another, we have no logical basis to claim that cause and effect is a permanent, universal rule of nature. This observation implied a state of epistemological isolation. If our knowledge is limited to what we sense, we only have access to our own disconnected mental representations, leaving the existence of an objective world in doubt. To visualize this limit, imagine human perception as a thick, warped slab of optical glass. The chaotic, unidentifiable mass behind the glass represents raw sensory data, the noise of the universe before the mind processes it. The warped glass itself represents human receptivity, the biological formatting that every piece of information must pass through to be perceived. Human experience is defined by the permanent, inescapable distortion created by this internal cognitive lens. Immanuel Kant responded to this deadlock by re-examining the relationship between the observer and the object. Kant's predecessors assumed that for knowledge to be true, the human mind had to conform to the objects it encountered. Kant proposed an inversion of this logic, a move he compared to the work of Nicolaus Copernicus. Just as Copernicus proved that the Earth revolves around the sun, Kant suggested that philosophy must factor in the motion of the observer. This shift established a new premise for modern philosophy. The objects of our experience must conform to the structures of human cognition. This revolution relies on a priori knowledge, truths independent of experience, like mathematics. Kant argued these universal truths are possible only because the mind applies its own structural rules to sensory data before it reaches conscious awareness. In this model, the mind functions as an active geometric engine, replacing the older concept of the brain as a passive blank slate. This suggests that the phenomenal world, the world we actually experience, is a regulated construct generated by the architecture of our own minds. Kant termed this system Transcendental Idealism, a framework that identifies the subjective conditions necessary for any experience to occur. This required a departure from the Newtonian view that space and time are infinite, independent realities that exist regardless of whether anyone is there to perceive them. Kant defined space and time as pure forms of sensible intuition. These forms function as mandatory formatting grids. They are the software our brains use to organize incoming sensory information into a coherent structure. We can visualize this process as a collision between raw input and mathematical structure. The jagged basalt represents the manifold of intuition, the disorganized raw sensory data bombarding the nervous system. The luminous 3D wireframe represents the mandatory spatial and temporal coordinates imposed by the mind to make that data readable. From this perspective, space and time are the tools the mind uses to render reality, rather than dimensions that exist outside of it. Sensory data formatted by space and time is still blind. It lacks the conceptual links needed to form a coherent, objective meaning. To bridge this gap, Kant identified a second faculty, the understanding. The understanding acts as an organizer, turning isolated sensations into unified thoughts. This organization happens through the categories, 12 pure a priori concepts the mind uses to sort experience. These include quantity, quality, relation, and modality. Kant used the term synthesis to describe the rapid, unconscious act of the understanding, forcing raw data into these categories. Synthesis is the mechanism that generates objective validity. It allows us to distinguish between a merely subjective feeling and an objective fact about the world. This implies that the fundamental laws of nature, such as the rule that every effect has a cause, are not discovered in the environment. Instead, they are laws the understanding imposes on nature. The laws of physics appear certain to us because the human understanding is the source of the necessary lawfulness found in our experience. This architecture creates a permanent boundary for human inquiry. Because knowledge requires both sensory data and the categories of the mind, we are restricted to the realm of appearances, or phenomena. This creates a hard limit on what the human mind can actually investigate. Beyond this limit lies the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, also known as the noumena. The noumenal realm represents reality as it exists entirely independent of our observation, free from space, time, and the human cognitive grid. Logic requires us to assume this noumenal world exists as the source of our sensory data, yet we are barred from knowing any of its specific properties. This boundary marks the end of traditional metaphysics. Any attempt to objectively prove the nature of God, the soul, or the beginning of the universe is a theoretical impossibility because these subjects exist beyond the reach of our cognitive hardware. Human reason is confined to its own parameters, leaving the absolute reality of things sealed away. This concludes in what scholars call the Kantian bargain, the decision to limit the scope of theoretical knowledge to make room for moral beliefs. By restricting human knowledge to phenomena, Kant secured the certainty of mathematics and Newtonian science within the boundaries of possible experience. Science remains certain because its laws are identical to the rules of the human cognitive lens. To study nature is to study the necessary way our own minds constructed. At the same time, the unknowable noumenal realm provides the logical space needed for human freedom. If the deterministic laws of nature only apply to appearances, then the human soul can exist as a free agent in the realm of things in themselves. The source of the light behind the lens remains forever obscured. The lens of transcendental idealism is a permanent part of the human condition. The world as it appears to us is the only reality we are equipped to navigate. We are isolated from absolute reality, yet our experience of the world is stable and predictable, because we are the ones who provide its fundamental structure.